Anthony twisted the lid off the medicine bottle, shook one of the tiny pills out into his hand, and held it up to the lamp. The light sat directly behind it, casting both the pill and his hand in deep shadow, like a miniature eclipse. Blood pressure medication had been a part of his daily routine for around 2 decades. It was, he knew quite well, the only reason that he was able to function as a teacher without actually popping a blood vessel, as well as one of the small factors keeping him from having another heart attack. His doctor, however, decided that it still wasn't quite enough and had switched him to a new type of pill. While DiMartino was happy to have anything new to help him keep the tension in his head from exploding and taking his skull with it, he wasn't too happy about the new medication. No matter when he took it, it put him to sleep, and that worried him a bit. It had only been a week since he'd switched over, so he hadn't gone back to Dr. Florence yet to complain, though he'd wanted to. Oh, how he'd wanted to. And had kept on taking it in the hopes that the problem would soon right itself. The first few days he had popped them right after breakfast, but after nearly passing out in front of his history class, he quickly switched to taking them in the afternoons after the end of the school day. As he looked down at the peach-colored circle sitting between his thumb and index finger, he debated on whether or not he should take it before going to bed. He had skipped his afternoon dose in the interest of keeping an eye on the kids during the bus ride, but he was wary of taking something that would put him to sleep when he was already going to be sleeping. The more he thought about it, the more paranoid the idea sounded, but he was afraid that the combination of actual sleep and lowered blood pressure might put him to sleep somewhat more permanently than he desired. The lamp went dark, blinding DiMartino temporarily. He blinked rapidly and turned his head to look over at the sleeping form of Coach Gibson in the far bed, but before his eyes could adjust, the light came back on. Instead of allowing his brain to settle back into its earlier debate, he popped the pill in his mouth and dry swallowed it. Ms. Defoe paced back and forth anxiously. "You're really too sensitive, Claire," Lee had told her when she had expressed her concerns about the row girl. "These children need to learn how to work both in groups and as individuals. This will be a grand opportunity for growth for... What was her name again?" The rest of the conversation had started to go downhill from there, so Claire had given up and retreated to the room she was sharing with Janet Barch. She hadn't even bothered talking to Janet about the situation. She could already hear the most likely response in her head, telling her that getting shunned would just help Stacy toughen up, so that way she wouldn't fall prey to some man later on in life. Claire had to admit that the science teacher's pathological philosophy certainly didn't lend to lack of sleep, as the markedly nasal snores coming from the other side of the room attested. But Claire's own ideals wouldn't allow her the same. Stacy had been in obvious distress, and it bothered her that that distress would be allowed to fester overnight. "You're turning into Timothy," Claire tried to warn herself, but it sounded hollow. Despite the unfortunate example O'Neill set, she knew it wasn't wrong to care about the students on a personal level and want to help them not just educationally but emotionally as well. Finally making up her mind, Claire threw a housecoat over her nightgown, put on a pair of slippers, grabbed her copy of the room key, and stepped out into the rapidly cooling night. Even with the massive school and rental buses sitting not too far away, the parking lot of the Erbie motel seemed desolately empty. She began her journey across it with a slight shiver at the loneliness that pervaded the air. The sound of one of the ice machines rumbling in the distance merely added to the effect, the low pitch of its refrigeration unit serving as a poignant dirge. She had just crossed the lot and stepped onto the street when everything shut down all at once. Starlight and a tiny sliver of moon provided the only illumination, and it seemed like every sound in both the natural and man-made worlds had simply stopped. Claire stood in the middle of the road and strained her ears, but she couldn't detect a trace of anything. No cars on the highway, no children playing music in their rooms, no crickets in the sparse tufts of grass. Then, just as suddenly, everything came back. The lamps overhead were taking their time turning back on, but the rumble of the ice machine was back and the soft choir of insects and other small animals of the nighttime countryside returned as if they'd never left. Shaking off the strange feeling left by the temporary blackout, Claire bundled her housecoat around herself and made her way across the street to the office of Nick's Inn. As soon as she was sure all of her roommates were asleep, Brittany poked her head out of the door and scanned the area with the eyes of a hawk. A night hawk that could see well at night. Confident that her movements would be unobserved, she slid out and locked the door behind her. With careful tiptoe steps and a continued alertness, she made her way to the corner of the building. Only a few doors separated her room and the corner, but her insistence on a high level of stealthiness made the journey stretch out over several minutes. She made not a sound, not a whisper, not a... She reached the corner and nearly screamed when a giant form loomed over her and let out a muffled roar. She got the brief impression of a male figure dressed in coveralls and gloves. His face appeared nearly featureless in the dim light, which glinted for a moment on what appeared to be wide-lensed goggles. The scream had caught in Brittany's throat, but the rest of her moved freely, snapping a kick to the attacker's midsection. As her leg came down, she twisted her torso and pushed forward, ramming her shoulder into his chest and sending him sprawling. Just as she reached his side and prepared to smash a heel into his head, he put up his hands in surrender and started pushing away from her with his legs. He seemed to be trying to say something, but she couldn't make it out until he reached up and pulled the paintball mask from his face. "It's just me, babe," Kevin whimpered pitifully. "Don't hurt me anymore, okay? I'm like totally sorry and stuff." "Kevy?" she breathed in surprise, then more angrily, "Kevy, what in the world are you doing?" The jock had just enough sense in him at least to look ashamed. He cradled his mask in one arm while pushing himself up with the other and said, "Aw, Britt, it's just a little joke. I mean, we're still going to do it, right?" Brittany glared hatefully at him, but her expression quickly softened. She couldn't stay mad at her Kevy for long. "Well, of course we are," she squeaked as she stepped forward and helped him back up. She then put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him lightly against the wall. "In fact," she said, her voice dropping an octave, "why don't you leave the mask on?" A wide grin broke out across Kevin's face just before it was covered by the paintball rig. The tint on the goggles made it difficult to see what was going on, but as Brittany slowly unzipped the front of his coveralls and reached in to caress his chest, he realized that sight wasn't the sense he really needed to be paying attention to anyway. Brittany's lips brushed against his neck, right under the jawline of the mask. She pushed down his collarbone as she pushed her hand further back, stroking her way across his ribs. He moaned into the mask's filter and congratulated himself on the idea of not wearing anything under his coveralls as she pushed the front open wider and laid butterfly kisses all along his pecs and abs. Gradually, tortuously, she moved further and further down, pulling the zipper along with her. When she finally reached her ultimate destination, Kevin pushed back hard against the side of the building and shoved his hips forward with a grunt of ecstasy. He thought, Stacy. Closed off in the miniature sensory deprivation chamber of the mask, Kevin found it easy to imagine Stacy Rowe was the one clinging to his pelvis, massaging his butt as her mouth worked all sorts of wonders on other parts of his anatomy. He kind of wished it was her, as he liked some variety from time to time, but the way things were going down, well, he couldn't really complain. What was that? Complaint started flooding into Kevin's head the second he felt cool air hit his nethers and heard Brittany's whispered question. The idea of getting caught pushed all those complaints to the side, however, so he quickly pushed the mask up and started asking, "What was what?" but stopped when it became immediately apparent. The area between the buildings they were in had been fairly dark to start off with, but with the disappearance of all the lights in the parking lot of the motel on one side and the diner on the other, everything had gone almost completely pitch black. An unnatural silence permeated the air, sending a chill down Kevin's spine. Then, it was over. The lights clicked back on, and the regular sounds of the night slipped back into place, dispelling the hold it had seemed to place over the two teenagers. Babe?" Kevin said, looking down at his girlfriend. "I'm, getting a little cold here, if you know what I mean." Brittany looked at him and then blinked in confusion. Then, "Oh, right, sorry, babe." Sliding the mask down, Kevin was back in his own personal heaven again. Warmth suffused his lower body and spread, radiating through his skin and muscles, relaxing him. He laid a hand on the side of Brittany's neck and rubbed his fingers gently upward until they pressed through the hair on the back of her head. He felt like he was floating downward, serene, down into a comfort he had never known before. Something was calling him, beckoning him into that comfort, slowly guiding him deeper and deeper, until before he realized it, he had closed his eyes and fallen asleep. Brittany's skin thrilled as Kevin's other hand came up to stroke across her cheek. Usually he just grabbed onto her and held her still, and she didn't really like that. But this time he was moving with a care he only rarely showed. Both hands moved up and down, kneading her along the neck and shoulders as they went along. Then suddenly he did grab her, pressing his palms into either side of her head. She grunted in surprise and pulled back, but he stayed on her, pushing against her temples with gradually increasing pressure. "Kevy, stop! Go back to what you were doing before," she said, then cried out, "Ow! You're starting to hurt me, babe! What are you doing?" She looked up at him, but only the blank mask looked back. She called out his name a few more times, but there was no answer as he pressed in harder and harder. "Darn it, babe, that's enough!" she cried out, then slapped his crotch to get his attention. When she still got no reaction, and with the ache in her head starting to become actual sharp pain, she pulled back and punched him square in the balls. He didn't even flinch. "Kevy, let go! Let go!" Brittany screamed. She punched him everywhere she could reach. She clawed at his hands, drawing blood. She tried shifting her legs to kick him in the shins, but she couldn't move back far enough to get into a good position. His hands held her close like a slowly closing vice. She sobbed. She pleaded with him. She screamed for help. She simply screamed. He leaned over and pressed even harder. Consciousness had just begun fading when she heard the first sickening crunch of her own skull fracturing. When the girl finally stopped moving, he released her. Her misshapen head hit the ground and slowly dripped blood to pool in the dirt. He looked down at the corpse, twisting his head to view it at different angles, but betrayed no sign of emotion. Once certain that she wasn't going to be getting up again anytime soon, he zipped up the coveralls and stalked off into the parking lot of Nick's Inn.